Hello everyone, and welcome to this new Q&A video on the channel to celebrate surpassing 30,000 subscribers, which is absolutely insane, especially considering we did it in less than 5 months after I started to make videos here. So really, thank you so much for that. I'll admit it too, and I'll be honest with you guys, the reason I decided to make this video this week instead of another alternate scenario I have planned is simply because I'm a little burned out. And I really need, really need to get some head start on planning my videos. First, to relieve my mental stress of not knowing if I'll be able to finish a video on time or not. Second, because I need to give my best in my work and in what I propose to you in terms of content so that you have a fair and reasonable incentive to support me by becoming members of the channel, and I will only achieve that by giving my best and having many videos in advance. So I will never stop fighting and working very hard until I'm finally worthy of your support, because one can only demand the support of their community when they deserve it, and right now, it doesn't feel like I deserve it. I'm not doing it that well, it's not enough yet, but I swear I'll get it. I swear that one day it will be worth supporting me by becoming members of the channel. But until that day comes, I want to express my deep gratitude to the first channel members who, even though it may not seem like much, have already made all the difference by supporting me, and I will always be very grateful for that because again, personally, I don't feel worthy of that support yet, so thank you so much for helping me grow in that way. In any case, with the introduction now over, we can move on to the part where I answer your questions. So the first question comes from Onyx 5491, asking the following thing. Was there any chance for the Republic to survive? Of course, I'm guessing you're referring to the Roman Republic Onyx 5491, so here's my answer to that question of yours. And the answer is both yes and no. If you mean the Republic surviving shortly after Caesar's time, and even during the first 2 centuries CE, then yes, absolutely. But here comes the tricky part of the question. How many internal problems did the Republic have to solve to even survive another coup like the one carried out by Julius Caesar? The answer is many things, but really, a lot of many things. Rebel dictators like Sulla had already set a great precedent and example for all the minimally ambitious men of the Republic, that they only needed to have the army loyal to them to overthrow whatever status quo the Senate in Rome had at that time. And beyond that, the Republic simply had too many problems to solve: extreme poverty and misery, a constant and unstable food crisis, a declining agricultural sector, an almost non-existent workforce due to the gigantic and considerable number of slaves, which eliminated the job opportunities of any Roman citizen, reducing them to almost nothing, with an almost non-existent social ascendancy, and with all that, a brutal increase in inflation of the Roman economy, combined with the monopoly of land and property ownership controlled by only a small and miserable handful of people, as was the case of Crassus, who organized fires of entire buildings on purpose, to force their owners to sell the property at miserable prices and who were not legitimate to accept to put out the fires, ruining the lives of millions in this way for years. And that's just a simple example, the most familiar to most of you, but the reality is that I could spend hours, days, expressing how unsustainable the Republic was in a way that would alarmingly remind us all much of what we are currently experiencing, especially younger generations like Gen Z. But come on, let's say that by some miracle, or similar to my alternate scenarios where realism is not the priority, all the Republic's problems are fixed, the economy and inflation are preserved, people regain some access or possibility to property, agriculture flourishes, the birth rate increases, and corruption in the government and in the Senate practically no longer exists, which is absolutely impossible normally in a real context, because remember kids, democracy doesn't work. Still, despite everything, the Republic would not survive in the conditions we know it, past the 2nd or 3rd century CE. The territory of the Republic had become too large, it had overextended itself too much compared to its possibilities. If the administration had not been reformed, and if the extremely bureaucratic, slow, and complex senatorial system for making any decision had been maintained, administering a territory as gigantic as the one the Republic had after the Third Punic War would continue to be absolutely impossible in the long term. Simply put, sometimes the most pragmatic and efficient way to manage such a large territory, especially in an era where traveling or communicating with other territories could take weeks, months, or in the worst case, years, was the norm. It was to simply leave everything in charge of an absolute ruler or leader who decided everything, and that the other administrators of the territories of that leader simply follow his orders and actions without hesitation, instead of sitting in a gigantic room surrounded by fat old proto-boomers talking nonsense for hours without taking absolutely any action, or making any decision as tiny as it may be. As a result, I want you to think about how many enemies that diminished, slower, more bureaucratically stagnant, and militarily disorganized Rome would have to face in the following centuries. To begin with, although the conquest of Gaul was entirely an offensive and at first glance unjustified conquest by Julius Caesar, that did not mean that the Gauls were not capable of suddenly and without warning invading and sacking Rome and its territories at any time, just as they had done in the past multiple times, with the sack of 390 BCE being the most famous of all. But there were also, of course, the Germans, who from the late 2nd century CE onwards would constantly try to immigrate into Roman territories in the most brutal and bloodthirsty ways possible, and their persistence was so great and immense that eventually they would completely succeed in destroying and replacing that empire. We know that at least one of the most important factors for Germanic immigration around those times was the climate change that Europe was suffering at that time, with temperatures progressively beginning to drop throughout the continent and beyond, which would force the Germans to immigrate more massively to survive in warmer lands such as those south of the Rhine and Danube rivers. So, regardless of the tensions and direct confrontations that the Germans would not have experienced in that hypothetical alternate timeline with the Romans, they would have invaded the Mediterranean sooner or later, starting by massacring the Celts, their natural enemies so to speak, and later they would obviously go to the places where there was the most civilization, organization, structure, food, wealth, and women, that is, the Roman Republic. There was also the threat of the Parthians to the east. The only reason they never managed to reach the heights of the Persian Empire of old was because of the constant defensive blockade that Rome's eastern borders represented. But if the Republic persists and the territories do not expand any further, it would only be a matter of time before the Parthians conquered a huge part of the eastern territories of Europe, and perhaps even Egypt. And speaking of Egypt, there would also be the cultural, intellectual, and linguistic division between the Greeks and the Latins. Without a unifying and absolutist governmental structure like the empire and the figure of the emperor, the Greek states to the east would have continued to maintain a certain hostility and rejection of Roman control, and a very intense and aggressive rivalry would have continued over the centuries, and this would have meant a great problem for the economy and food trade of the Romans, as they had always depended largely on foreign grain exports to feed their large population before the empire. In that context, Roman assimilation into Greek culture would not have been so certain or decisive, especially with the Ptolemaic dynasty surviving, able to influence and ally at times with other Greeks with the justification of overthrowing Roman control. All of this and much more makes the survival of the Roman Republic a very complex exercise to imagine, but I have no doubt that one day I will try to address it in one of my videos, although it will undoubtedly be very difficult for me to find a satisfactory answer. But for now, that's all I'll say. Yes, technically the Roman Republic could have survived, but if you're talking about surviving the first 2 or 3 centuries after Julius Caesar, beyond that time, simply no, never, because democracy and bureaucracy of old, fat, incompetent, boomer-like people would never work in the long run. I hope my answer was satisfactory, Onyx 5491. The second question comes from Cadentuazan 3079, asking me if the Emperor Constantine didn't move the capital of Rome to the east, and therefore didn't found the city of Constantinople. Well, Cadentuazan 3079, if Constantine hadn't moved the capital to Constantinople, he would have been forced to deal much more closely with the Roman elites and the still deeply rooted pagan culture of the West. Unlike the East, which by that point already had large Christian populations, the West was still far more attached to the old gods and traditions. This means Constantine would never have been able to push Christianity as aggressively as he did. Instead, he would have had to compromise with the Senate, with the aristocracy, and with Roman religion itself. So ironically, while his goal was probably, in the long run, we're not sure, but probably, to build a Christian empire, staying in Rome might have slowed down that process. Christianity would still spread, but more gradually, more tolerantly, and alongside pagan traditions instead of replacing them outright. That also means the West would have preserved much of its martial vigor, its classical culture, and its sense of continuity with the old Roman spirit. Now, let's think about resources, all the wealth, administration, and manpower that Constantine drained from Rome to found Constantinople would have stayed in Italy. That alone would have strengthened the Western Empire significantly, allowing it to resist barbarian invasions with greater efficiency. I think the West could have lasted longer, perhaps even surviving intact until the Arab conquests, and while the East would still be struggling against the Sassanids and later the Arabs, it might have collapsed earlier, leaving the Western Empire as the sole surviving Roman state during the Middle Ages. In short, Constantine's decision was smart for his personal plans and beliefs to create a Christian empire in the East, but in the long run, it weakened the West. Ironically, if he had stayed in Rome, the Latin world might have remained pagan at heart, stronger, and perhaps even the true OG Roman Empire would carried on through the medieval world, but with less Greek influence. The next question comes from Darkfire Earl, asking me the following thing. What if the Roman Empire had Pokemons? Honestly, that question made me laugh so hard, but I also have to admit that I don't have the slightest idea. I know absolutely nothing about the Pokemon franchise, and I've never been a fan. I just know what popular culture generally knows about Pokemons due to how popular they were in the 2000s and how everyone couldn't stop bothering me with that shit during class breaks. But I suppose if Pokemon existed, the Romans, being the great domesticators that they were, would try to domesticate, control, and turn them into living weapons for their armies and other useful fields where they could be useful, depending on whether there is a Pokemon that can help with agriculture, which again, I have no idea. But I imagine funny situations like the Romans threatening their enemies with the fury of Zeus himself in their faces, ordering a Pikachu to throw lightning bolts. That would be very funny. But yeah, beyond that, I have no idea what they would do with them, sorry, but like I said, I've never been a Pokemon fan, so no idea. The next question comes from DBX Invincible, asking me the following thing. If I could invite a Roman historical figure to my channel to comment on one of my stories, who would I choose and why? And so to answer you, I think the simplest, but at the same time obvious, option would be Augustus, choosing him to talk about my alternate scenario about him becoming immortal, the first video I made on this channel. I would just love to have his own opinion and analysis of my work and his vision of it, and to know if he would have really done everything he did in that video of mine, if he would have been able to live forever. The nenext question comes from DelsonPace 6957, asking me the following thing. In my opinion, who are the top 3 worst rulers of Rome? Well, obviously, as DelsonPace 6957 himself asked me, that top 3 would be my opinion. Please keep that in mind. And being the worst emperor depends on many factors, because you can be an excellent general, but a terrible politician, or the other way around, or be bad at both, or be weak, or too cruel, leave a long-term positive legacy, insignificant and forgettable, or leave very negative foundations for the future of the empire. I hope you take that into account when tolerating my top 3. My top 3 would be Commodus, for obvious reasons. My top 2 would be Theodosius I, again for obvious reasons when you know my opinion about Christianity. And my top 1 would be Constantine I, again, being an obvious choice when you know my opinion on Christianity. The next question comes from Newborn Viking 9721, asking me the following thing. What if the Roman Empire had ended during the end of World War II? A very strange and curious question, but I will try to answer as best as possible without going into too much detail. And simply put, if by some miracle the Roman Empire had survived until World War II, I have to assume that the Germans and Angles would also have survived as separate entities from Roman culture to this day, for reasons I will mention below. Because, of course, there can be no world wars without the Germans, and there can be no end to Greco-Latin hegemony without the Anglo-Saxons. If the Roman Empire ends, it would surely be because, just like in our timeline, the Americans, out of hypocritical virtue signaling as they did in our history with the European empires, would force Europe to decolonize and slowly abandon their territories, thus losing their hegemony and economic power that would benefit the soft control of the United States throughout the West. And all of that would only happen because, for some sad reason, the Romans would have been in decline since the beginning of the 20th century and would have been extremely incompetent and useless during World War II, having to depend on Uncle Sam to save them from being conquered again by the Germans, and thus having to abandon the idea of imposing their conditions and hegemony on the world. And eventually, the empire would break up into tiny, insignificant nations with layers of fake democracy, controlled by the Germans, who in turn would be controlled by the Americans, just like we are today, poor, useless nations with no industry, no production, no wealth to offer, and only dependent on scamming and robbing tourists during the summer to take a long nap during the winter. And that would be it, basically, a pretty similar outcome to our true timeline, more or less. The next question comes from Jack DS7C, asking the following thing. What if the Roman Empire moved to Egypt after the fall of the West and the East falls to the Visigoths, and they fought Muhammad and the rise of Islam? Alright, another crazy question, but I'll try to answer it as best as I can, even though it is extremely hard to imagine what would have happened, but I hope my answer will be enough for you, Jack DS7C. So, if, after the fall of the West, and even the fall of Constantinople to the Visigoths, the Roman Empire somehow shifted its center of power to Egypt, we'd be looking at a very different, crazy alternate timeline. Egypt was the breadbasket of the Mediterranean, incredibly rich, fertile, and strategically placed. From Alexandria, the Romans could control trade routes through the Red Sea, project power into Africa, and even keep an eye on Arabia. Now, about Islam, if the Roman Egyptian state had survived during the 7th century, they would have directly faced the rise of Muhammad and the early Islamic conquests. This would have been a clash not only of armies, but of civilizations at their very birth. The Romans would have had advantages, fortified cities like Alexandria, a strong naval presence in the Mediterranean, and centuries of administration. But at the same time, the new Islamic movement was fueled by an extraordinary religious bloodlust and rapid expansion. So what happens? I think the Romans in Egypt could have resisted the first waves, maybe even keeping Islam contained in Arabia for a while. If that happened, the spread of Islam would have been delayed, and the Roman presence in the eastern Mediterranean might have remained stronger for centuries, but in the long run, the question would be whether this Roman Egyptian state could reform and adapt, or whether it would collapse like the West did before it, which sadly, I think the second option is more likely. In short, Rome moving to Egypt would have been both brilliant and risky. Brilliant because of the wealth and strategic position, but risky because it would have put them right in the path of one of history's most powerful religious and military movements that definitely had the potential to destroy them completely in their reduced, limited, and geographically exposed state. The next question comes from Random Guy 6152, asking me the following thing. What if Rome was Greek, and rather than spreading Latin in the West, they spread Hellenism, rather than Pyrrhus saving Greeks from Latins? He'd be spreading Epirote influence into Italy against a rival Greek power, rather than being seen as a barbarian intruding on Alexander's successors' conflicts. They'd be yet another heir of Hellas. Once again, a crazy alternate scenario idea. You guys are definitely on crack, but once again, I'll try to answer it the best I can do. Well, firstly, if Rome were fully absorbed into the Greek world, the dynamic of history would completely change. Rome would not be this proud, stubbornly independent Latin power forging its own path. Instead, it would become an extension of Hellenistic civilization, another heir to Alexander's world. If, for example, Rome and much of Italy had voluntarily aligned with Macedon after Alexander's death, then Pyrrhus fighting in Italy wouldn't be remembered as a Greek savior against the barbarians, but as just another chapter in the endless civil wars between Alexander's successors. Italy would have been drawn into those struggles as part of the Greek world. Rome might have risen as a strong city-state within that framework, but it would never have created its unique Latin identity. Now, here's the key. Latin culture gave Rome its endurance, its pragmatism, its legal and military systems that made it so different from the Greeks, at least in the beginning. Without that Latin character, Rome might have been powerful, but it would have been one more Greek kingdom among many. We would not have had the Roman Republic, or the Roman legions as we know them, nor the Latin language shaping Europe. Instead, the Mediterranean would have become a Greek lake, and Hellenism, not the concept of Romanitas, would have been the dominant force in European history. So in this alternate timeline, yes, Hellenism spreads further west, but ironically, without Rome's distinct identity, the unity and stability of the Mediterranean world might never have happened. Rome's strength was precisely that it was not Greek, that it forged its own destiny, and that's why it became eternal, because it was more based than the Greekoids. The next question comes from Sir Ignacio, asking me the following thing. What if the Iberians become an empire? Far before the Roman Republic rose, making a three-power fight or dynamic in the Mediterranean between the rising Roman Republic, the Carthaginian Republic, and the Iberic Empire. Okay, that's another crazy one. Less crazy, but equally unlikely. The Iberian Peninsula was very decentralized, unpopulated, and poorly urbanized. If you think the Celts in Gaul were very divided and poorly urbanized, then consider that, in comparison, the Gauls lived centuries ahead of the Iberian Celts socially. But still, I'll try to come up with a halfway decent answer. Now, Iberia in antiquity was incredibly rich in resources, silver mines, agriculture, and a strong warrior culture. The problem historically was that it was fragmented into many tribes, but if for some reason, say a charismatic king or a federation of tribes, Iberia had united into a centralized empire, it could have become a true Mediterranean power. Imagine the dynamics. Instead of the Punic Wars being a duel between Rome and Carthage, you now have a three-way struggle: Rome in Italy, Carthage in North Africa, and an Iberian Empire across the Western Mediterranean. This would have completely changed history. Carthage would have had a far harder time maintaining its dominance because Iberia was its main source of manpower and silver. With an Iberian Empire controlling its own mines and ports, Carthage would have been weakened from the start. Now, Rome's rise would also be far more complicated, facing both Carthage to the south and an Iberian superpower to the west. The Roman Republic might not have had the same freedom to expand. Rome's wars would have been deadlier, its victories less certain, and it's possible that the Republic would have been checked before it could dominate the Mediterranean. In such a world, the Mediterranean might have never become a Roman lake, but instead, you'd have a balance of powers: Iberia, Carthage, and Rome all struggling for dominance. Who would win in the long run? No idea, but I'd say Iberia has a good and decent chance to win if united like in this very crazy hypothetical situation. With its natural resources, fertile lands, and Atlantic access, an Iberian Empire could have had the staying power to outlast both Rome and Carthage, perhaps becoming the dominant force of the Western Mediterranean, at least briefly. But again, all of this is very hypothetical and unrealistic by a long shot. The next question comes from the user Heine23A, asking me the following thing. Didn't Roman emperors wear crowns? At least not in the same style that later European kings would, as crowns are often said to be symbolic of halos or solar imagery. Would Roman emperors wearing crowns have developed as a thing? That's actually a really good question, and one that is related to my most recent video about Emperor Aurelian surviving, but let's answer your question anyway, because you're right. Roman emperors didn't wear crowns the way medieval kings did. They had the laurel wreath, later the diadem, but not the heavy jeweled crowns that became symbols of Christian monarchs in the Middle Ages. Now, if we imagine a timeline where Sol Invictus becomes the main deity of the empire, essentially turning Rome into a monotheistic or henotheistic solar religion, then yes, I do think crowns could have developed as a major imperial symbol. Why? Because crowns are not just about authority, they're about radiance, the halo of power, the divine light. With Sol Invictus as the supreme god, the crown itself could be reinterpreted as the sun's rays, a visible sign that the emperor is chosen by, or even the earthly representative of the unconquered sun, the Sol Invictus. The next question comes from L_Lolliat1246, asking me the following thing. How long does it take me to make a video? Well, L_Lolliat1246, as many content creators will often answer you, it depends. But generally, the part that takes me the longest to do, the hardest for me, and personally, the one that I hate the most, is writing the script. That can take me between 2 to 3 days, depending on how motivated I am, or how familiar I am with the topic of the video, or the time period in which it takes place. Then there's the editing part, which can take the same amount of time, between 2 to 3 days, depending on how motivated I am, and also how long the video is, and it's also a part that, although I don't hate it, isn't my favorite at all. No, my favorite part is making maps and creating the thumbnails. That's really the only two things that I enjoy doing, although sadly, it's also the least time-consuming for me, although recently I've been pushing myself to make maps with more detailed and complicated borders, which takes more time, but is totally worth the effort. But in general, if you want to get a clearer idea, more or less, depending on how dense and complicated the video is to make, it can take me 3 or 4 times as long in hours as the video takes in minutes to make. So, for example, if a video is 20 minutes long, just assume it took me between 60 to 80 hours of work to make it from start to finish. That multiplication and conversion of minutes to hours is the most faithful and accurate way to compare the actual time it takes to make my videos in total. So yeah, when a video of mine is like 40 minutes long, just assume I've barely slept in a week to get it done. That pace of life is extremely hard. I'm not going to lie to you guys, but I hope that at least you always like the end result, which in itself is the only thing that matters. The next and last question comes from Javier Olivares Martinez, 2197, asking me the following thing. How did I come up with the idea of creating my YouTube channel? Well, you see, I've been pondering the question of whether or not to join the English-speaking community for quite some time now. Because for those who don't know, I used to make videos in Spanish, but as I've grown up, matured, and begun to appreciate and value Greco-Roman history as being of vital interest and importance in order to understand the current situation facing our dying civilization, I realized there was a very important niche related to Rome that I could reach by making videos in English. For some reason, you people, and by you people, I mean the native English speakers in my community, have a great fascination and interest in Greco-Roman culture, and especially in the Roman Empire. And I mean, I'm not complaining, not at all, but sadly, I have to tell you something very sad and pathetic. This interest and hype around the Roman Empire that, to a large extent, internet culture has revived in recent years, especially since 2020. I wonder why. It's not an interest that those who should normally be directly concerned are. Sadly, no matter how hard I tried for years, Hispanic culture had become too barbaric in order to have the necessary taste to appreciate anything minimally intellectual. And I say minimally intellectual because frankly, what I do isn't academic at all, it's pure entertainment, but even that is already too advanced and pedantic for the limited minds of some people. Sadly, Latins, and by Latins I mean us, the OG Latins, those from Southern Europe, those around the Mediterranean, have become too disinterested in those things, that niche, and in the history of our glorious Greco-Roman ancestors, not even being a shadow of what we once were. But in any case, I finally accepted that, for now, the Roman spirit was still dormant in my people, and that simply their barbaric, brain-rotten minds had not yet healed, and that they were not yet ready to embrace true baseness. And believe me, I don't say this with malice, no, I promise, but with a true and profound sadness that breaks my heart to the depths of my soul. In any case, meanwhile, in the Anglo community, I saw how the Roman hype continued to grow in recent years, and when I finally felt ready, both in terms of knowledge and fluency in the English language, I decided to take the risk of competing with other content creators about alternate scenarios. Now, I want to clarify one thing before what I'm going to say next. I want to clarify that I have no problems or conflicts with any of the content creators in my niche. On the contrary, I deeply respect them, and I appreciate much of their work and have followed them constantly, for years in fact. Is that clear? Have you understood that I respect them and don't want any fights or drama? Good. So, despite respecting them, I'm surprised that they haven't realized something very obvious to me, if their goal, of course, is to grow their channel and get as many views as much as possible. And that thing is that they, for some reason that escapes my understanding, are absolutely convinced that alternate history videos about the two world wars are the ones that bring in the most views. And maybe that's true in the long term. But in the short term, I'm telling you, nothing, absolutely nothing brings in more views and subscribers than alternate Roman scenarios. As I told you before, at the beginning of the 2020s, there was a shift. For some reason, the hype of the Roman Empire had revived massively among young people. First, with memes and TikTok trends like the famous one about how often do you think about the Roman Empire, but then it became a deeper, more serious, more introspective topic, as if somehow the new generations were subconsciously looking for answers in the Roman Empire to understand what was going on in our shitty modern times, especially for Gen Z and, to some extent, millennials. At least that's how I feel personally that it happened. And honestly, I don't know if I'm right or not, but I think it's because deep down in our subconscious, our soul, our culture, and for those of us who are directly descended from the Romans, our blood, in a very subtle and collectively subconscious way, we know that it is almost time, there's very little time left for something to happen, and that something, I don't know how yet, will have something to do with Rome. That's the only thing I'm sure of. I feel that very soon, in our lifetime maybe, something will happen related to Rome or the Roman Empire that will make the Renaissance seem like a small hype compared to the true attempt at a Western Renaissance that we are going to experience very soon. And I wanted to be part of that inspiration, that trend, that hype, that movement. But since I'm not an intellectual or academic person, I thought the only way I could contribute to that Roman Renaissance would be through entertainment, entertaining a friendly, nice, and cool community through funny videos of alternate Greco-Roman scenarios, regardless of whether they're realistic or not, just to entertain and create interest in my audience so that, after watching my videos, they can research for the true Roman history. That is my main objective for now when creating my content, to intrigue and interest people in Roman history with my creations and videos, and by extension, to continue contributing to that trend that started a couple of years ago, since 2020 more or less, of becoming interested in and reviving Greco-Roman culture. First it was with Wojak memes, then with TikTok trends, now with alternate stories, and who knows, maybe the next step will lead to something even more concrete and special. Only time will tell. Deep down, in the depths of my heart, my greatest hope is that our Western culture, the true OG Western culture, will revive and prevail, and that those of my generation, Gen Z, who have suffered so much, will finally have the right to have the life we have always wanted, and perhaps that life will be given to us by one and only one answer, and that answer is called Rome. That's my hope, and you could even say, as gay as it sounds, my love letter to you and the audience watching me, and I hope deep in my soul, in the name of the love I carry for my culture, that you also think the same as I do. And after that last response, which was very heavy on emotions and feelings on my part, which I hope you felt it was sincere, that we are going to finish it for today. I hope you enjoyed this video, despite its lack of editing, but as I said, I made it to finally buy some time ahead for future true videos. Thank you all for listening to the end, and again, thank you all so much for surpassing 30,000 subscribers. This is becoming a great community and a great story to come. I can feel it. I'm deeply grateful, honored, and happy to have you as my subscribers, and I am sure, as I said, that this is just the beginning. And I apologize in advance for not being able to answer all the questions you sent me, but as you saw, the video is already too long, so sadly, I couldn't answer all of you. I hope you understand and forgive me for that. Anyway, don't forget to subscribe, like the video, become a member of the channel in order to have early access to new videos, and comment on what you thought of it. Thank you to our newest member of the channel, Francesco Gaipa. Shout out to you, and I deeply appreciate your support of my work and projects to come. And without anything else to say, see you next time!